Someone is sitting with something they haven't said, not because they forgot, not because the feeling faded, because the feeling became too large to keep pretending it wasn't there. And right now, in this exact cosmic window, the weight of that unsaid thing is pressing against them from the inside in a way they can no longer reroute. They have tried. You may not know the specific shape of the attempt, but you can feel the result of it, in the quality of a silence that doesn't behave the way silences are supposed to, in the particular kind of absence that is too full to be empty. You already know this, not as a wish projected outward, as something your body received before your mind had language for it. There's a particular quality to being held in someone's awareness. It doesn't announce itself. It simply arrives as a fact your nervous system recognized before you could decide what to do with it. The back of the neck. A name arriving with its full weight, not as a thought you chose, but as something that was already there when you surfaced into consciousness. And what you've been carrying in the background of your ordinary days, the sense that something between you is not finished, that the silence is not the answer it was supposed to be, is not in your head. Today, the sky confirmed it. Not gradually, precisely. Before we go deeper into what this transit is doing and why it's doing it now, like this video, subscribe and comment below. I'm ready to receive. Not for the algorithm, for yourself. As a declaration, your nervous system can hear that you showed up for this with your whole attention, not just part of it. Because what arrives in this transmission is not small. The part of this that is meant for you will land differently when you're fully here. What you saw that others around you explained away, that is exactly what put you in this room today. Most people, when a connection goes quiet, look for the simplest interpretation. Distance means disinterest. Silence means the answer was no. Delay means the chapter closed. These interpretations are easier to carry than the truth. They allow the mind to file the experience and stop spending energy on something that will not be resolved. You didn't do that. Not because you couldn't. The easy interpretation was available and there were moments when you almost accepted it, but because when you looked at the silence carefully, you noticed it didn't behave the way endings behave. You held it up to the light, and what you saw was not the flat finality of something truly finished. It was the specific pressure of something that had gone underground and was still moving there. Not dead, not resolved, submerged. There is a real difference between a feeling that ended and a feeling that went quiet to survive. You saw that distinction when it would have been so much easier not to. You chose to stay with what you actually saw instead of the version that would have been simpler to carry. That quality of seeing, honest, undistorted, willing to stay with the real thing even when it was harder to hold than the easy version, is not something that can be forced or decided into existence. You developed it through specific experiences that required you to keep looking when looking was uncomfortable. That is the credential this moment required. Not as a cosmic favor, as the consequence of having done invisible work in private without anyone confirming it was working. You built something inside yourself that has no surface presentation. There was no announcement. No day when you could point to a visible shift in your circumstances and say, this is where it changed. The renovation happened below the level of what anyone could see, in the quality of how you held something unresolved, in the way that holding gradually changed from gripping to bearing and then to something closer to understanding. The door opens for someone who rebuilt themselves in private, not someone who processed publicly. Someone who did the work where no one could see it, with no confirmation it was working, and kept going anyway. That person is you, and that is why you are here. Now, let's talk about what is actually happening in the sky today, and what it means for you right now in the most practical, specific human terms possible. The moon entered Libra today at exactly 10:34 in the morning, and a few minutes after that, at 1:07 in the afternoon, the Sun in Gemini locked into a precise square with the North Node in Pisces. Then Mercury, still in Gemini, moved into direct opposition with Lilith in Sagittarius. 3 events, 1 morning. And when you understand what each of these does to the human emotional field, not as astrological concepts but as lived, felt experience, you will understand why today feels different from yesterday in ways that are not emotional weather. They are structural shifts. The moon governs what you feel before you have words for it. It is the part of human experience that exists beneath thought. The emotional body, the place where belonging lives. The part of you that knows something is wrong before your mind can identify what. Not a slow awareness. a fast one. When someone walks into a room and the quality of your attention shifts before you've processed why, that is the moon. When a song bypasses the thinking mind and lands directly in something older, that is the moon. It is your emotional intelligence operating below the threshold of deliberate awareness. When the moon moves into Libra, the sign of balance, of partnership, of the specific ache that lives inside unfinished relational business, it shifts the emotional weather for every person in a way that is felt before it is understood. Libra is not gentle romanticism. That is what people mistake it for. Libra is the deep need for things to be resolved, for the scales to settle, for what is unspoken to finally find language. It cannot tolerate imbalance indefinitely, not because it is impatient, but because imbalance registers as a physical discomfort with nowhere productive to go. It creates a restlessness in the heart specific to one thing, the awareness that something between two people is not finished, and the silence around it is costing both of them something real. The Sun in Gemini squaring the North Node in Pisces is a different kind of force entirely. The North Node is the soul's compass direction, not where you've been comfortable, not where you've built your habits, but where you are actually being called to grow. When the Sun, the planet of conscious identity, locks into a direct square with the North Node, it creates a specific kind of friction. Not painful friction, clarifying friction. The kind that forces the question, is the version of yourself you are currently inhabiting actually aligned with the person your soul is asking you to become? Or are you still performing an older, more comfortable identity that has already completed its usefulness? Today's square does not ask this gently. It applies direct pressure. For someone who has already done the internal work, who has already chosen to grow toward their actual direction rather than the familiar one, today's square feels like confirmation, like the universe finally having the language to say out loud what was already true inside. Mercury opposing Lilith is the wildest energy of all three. Mercury governs the mind's relationship with truth. What gets said, what gets held back, what gets shaped into acceptable form before it reaches another person. Lilith is something else entirely. She is the unfiltered, unperformed truth, what a person actually feels before social conditioning arrives to edit it. She is the voice that has been waiting behind the silence, not politely, not patiently, but with a growing intensity that has everything to do with how long it has been made to wait. When Mercury directly opposes Lilith, the suppressed truth stops being suppressible. The words that have been gathering pressure behind the silence do not wait anymore. They press forward, not as a decision someone makes, as an inevitability the situation creates. The gap between what is felt and what is said becomes impossible to maintain at its previous width. Something has to give. Something is giving right now. What these three events create together, the moon in Libra demanding resolution, the sun squaring the North Node confronting alignment, Mercury opposing Lilith making the unspoken unbearable, is this, an emotional field in which the internal cost of continued silence finally, precisely, exceeds the internal cost of honesty. This is not ordinary longing amplified. This is the specific moment when something that could be held before can no longer be held. And someone in your field crossed that line today. This is not a soft invitation. This is a threshold. And thresholds do not open for everyone who arrives at it. This portal activates specifically for people who loved something real and continued to honor that reality, even when honoring it cost them comfort. For people who did not collapse the experience of loving without full return into something more manageable just because manageable would have been easier to live with. For people who let the specific experience of this connection genuinely change them, not as damage, but as instruction. What is the specific type of person this activates for? Someone who carried the full weight of what they felt without requiring the other person to carry half of it. Someone who, when the silence came, did not immediately build a story around it to make it bearable, but stayed with the discomfort of not knowing long enough to let it teach them something. That is not patience. Patience implies waiting for something external to arrive. This is the willingness to remain in contact with what is unresolved rather than numb it into something smaller that could be filed. That was not love failing. That was love being honest, showing you, through the specific texture of the imbalance, exactly what you needed to understand about what depth requires from both sides of a connection, not just one. That was not you being unworthy of receiving. That was them being unready to give. The distinction matters enormously. One interpretation leaves you as the problem to be solved. The other locates the truth accurately, two people at different stages of readiness, and the experience of that gap teaching you something about timing that cannot be taught any other way. That was not the universe withholding. That was the universe building. Building inside you something that could not be built any other way, the specific knowledge, lived in the body, of what it feels like to hold something real and full inside a container that was not yet capable of holding it back. And what that experience built in you is not bitterness, not guardedness, something more like a very precise internal compass for what genuine readiness feels like versus what performing readiness looks like. The person this portal opens for carries something now that others who took the easier path do not. The ability to tell the difference between genuine readiness and the performance of it, not in theory, but on contact. That is what you now carry. And that is exactly what makes you capable of receiving what this window is opening. Stay with this. What comes next is the part most people miss. Here's what needed to happen first, and why this arrived at exactly the right time and not a moment sooner. If this had arrived earlier, 6 months ago, a year ago, you would have given everything for a fraction in return. Not because you were weak, because the longing was still louder than the discernment. You would have received partial presence and called it love. You would have interpreted the softening as the shift you had been waiting for and invested everything into completing the connection from your side, which would have meant, again, carrying more than your share. Not because you were asked to, because the part of you that was still measuring its worth against the quality of what was returned would have quietly offered everything to make the fraction feel like the whole. The experience would not have been different. It would have been the same dynamic in new language, and you would have worn it willingly because the need was still large enough to override the knowing. The longing would have distorted the signal. What arrived as partial would have been received as complete because you needed it to be. The universe is not casual about timing. It does not delay out of indifference or as a lesson about patience. It delays with a specificity that only becomes visible in retrospect. What the silence was protecting was not the other person's readiness. What it was protecting was yours. Saturn, the planetary force that governs what gets made permanent, what requires genuine completion before the next chapter opens, does not lift restrictions until the lesson has moved from concept to embodied reality. Not until it lives in the actual way you move through the world. Not until the understanding has changed your behavior without you having to decide to change it, because the understanding became real enough to change it from the inside. Saturn is not interested in whether you understand the lesson intellectually. It is interested in whether you have become someone the lesson has permanently altered. You have. The way you no longer reach when you used to reach. The way the urgency that used to accompany the feeling has become something quieter. The way you can hold what you feel without being organized around its resolution. These are not signs of having given up. They are signs of the lesson having become real in the body rather than only real in the mind. The silence was not their answer. It was the universe's answer, holding the space closed until what needed to form inside it had fully formed. What is here now, in the space previously occupied by the waiting, is something that was not there before. Something that does not require the other person's arrival to exist. The wait did not produce that. The specific quality of what you did inside the wait produced it. That is the distinction that makes the timing real rather than arbitrary. And there is one more thing happening right now, on the other side of the silence, that changes the entire meaning of what you have been living through. The person connected to you is not suppressing what they feel. They moved past that. They are not telling themselves a story about why they shouldn't feel it. They moved past that too. They are sitting at the edge, not held in place by avoidance, not protected by rationalization, but sitting in the full, unmanaged weight of what honesty would require them to admit about themselves, about what they want, about what the silence has cost, not just you, but them, about who they would have to become to say what they actually feel out loud. This is the almost ready. The person in this position is not someone who doesn't know what they feel. They know. They have known for longer than the silence suggests. What they are sitting with is not the question of whether the feeling is real. It is the full, sober weight of what speaking it out loud would require. What it would mean about who they are. What it would mean about the choices they made during the silence. What it would ask them to accept as true about themselves, about their capacity for honesty, about the specific fears that made silence feel safer than admission. Today's Mercury-Lilith opposition makes the internal room where these feelings live impossible to keep locked. The words that have been gathering pressure behind the silence are not waiting anymore. They are pressing against the inside of every ordinary conversation, every moment of stillness, every stretch of day where the attention is not fully occupied. The thought arrives mid-task, not as a memory drifting in softly from a distance, but as a present tense reality that the mind keeps returning to regardless of what it was trying to do. The thought does not knock. It is simply there when the mind clears for a moment, already present, already carrying its full weight. The body is carrying this differently than it was even a week ago. There is a specific quality to holding something at the edge of being said, a pressure between the throat and the solar plexus that surfaces in the gap between what is being said and what is actually being thought. That pressure is not painful exactly, but it is no longer comfortable in the way that suppressed things can become comfortable over time. The comfort wore away. What is left is the full awareness of what the silence contains, with nowhere for that awareness to go as long as it remains unspoken. The moon in Libra is not making this easier to hold. Libra experiences incompletion as a restlessness that refuses to be redirected into other channels. Every attempt to file the awareness and return to the ordinary is working less efficiently than it did last week. The moments of pure, ordinary activity, where the awareness of what is unresolved can be temporarily set aside, are lasting shorter stretches than before. And the sun squaring the north node is asking them whether the direction they are currently moving is actually aligned with the person they are supposed to become. The answer to that question requires honesty. And the question is not being asked quietly. They know. They have always known. Today is the day the knowing became too heavy to carry quietly. Now, you are standing at a crossroads, and the choice is not dramatic from the outside. It is quiet. It is interior. But interior choices carry the most weight because they determine not just what you do next, but who you are when you do it. The fork in the road looks identical from the outside. The difference is entirely interior, and entirely everything. One internal state is familiar. You know its texture. It contracts slightly in the throat. It leans forward into the uncertainty, monitoring for signals. The reply that hasn't come, the silence being read as information, the absence of an answer creating the urgency that movement from that state requires. It moves faster than the situation requires because the speed feels like control and control feels like safety. It grips, not out of conscious fear, out of the old habit of believing that holding tightly is the same as not losing something. This is the version of you that still needs the external confirmation to feel certain. The reply, the signal, the evidence that the waiting was worth it. And as long as you are operating from that state, you are asking the connection to carry the weight of your uncertainty rather than simply being in contact with what is true. The other internal state is different in texture entirely. It is not indifference. Nothing about it is cold or closed. It is the quality of having set something down without abandoning it. The shoulders settle without being instructed to. A breath goes 1 inch deeper than the last 3 months of breathing. This state does not reach. It does not monitor. It understands, somewhere below thought, that love which is real does not evaporate while you are standing in your own ground. That what is genuinely aligned does not require urgency to hold it in place. That the certainty of what you feel does not need to be proved by the other person's action in order to remain real. Can you feel the difference between those two right now? Not as a concept, in your body. This is not the universe withholding. This is the universe waiting to see which version of you steps forward. One state contracts around the question, is this coming? The other holds the question without being organized around its answer. One reaches, one simply is. The reaching state is familiar and feels like doing something. The grounded state is unfamiliar and can feel at first like doing nothing, which is why it is harder to choose. The question that lives at the center of this crossroads is this: can you hold what is real without needing it to arrive on a timeline you set in order to feel safe? Not as a philosophy, as an actual interior experience you are either living or you are not. That question, held in the body rather than analyzed in the mind, will show you exactly where you actually are, not where you intended to be, not where you hope you are, where you are. Beneath all of this, beneath the transit, the timing, the other person's reckoning, there is a deeper agreement, one that existed before this chapter began, one that is entirely, specifically about what this experience was always going to require you to learn about yourself. Soul contracts are not romantic arrangements. They are not promises of forever wrapped in spiritual language. They are precise agreements about what must be activated, confronted, and genuinely integrated before the next version of a life can begin. They are not about the other person staying or leaving. They are about what the experience of this specific connection was always going to force you to face in yourself, what question it was built to answer, what wound it was constructed to open so that the opening could finally begin to close. This connection came to teach you something about timing, not patience as a virtue, timing as a structural truth about love. The specific lesson lives here, that love and readiness must arrive simultaneously to be real, that the most genuine feeling in the world, offered at a moment when one person is ready and the other is not yet capable of receiving it at full depth, does not produce the connection it deserves. It produces something smaller, something that costs the person who is ready more than it gives. Something held together not by mutual arrival, but by one person's willingness to wait inside the other person's incompletion and call that waiting love. You learned this through your body, through the lived experience of offering something full and receiving something partial in return, and watching yourself keep offering anyway, not because you were naive, but because the love was real, even when the conditions weren't ready for it. That is not weakness. It is a particular kind of courage that only people capable of genuine depth ever develop. But the lesson inside it was always this: the right person at the wrong internal moment is still the wrong moment. Not wrong forever, wrong now. And the difference between now and right, that gap, is the whole lesson. Give yourself a moment with the grief of recognizing this. The grief is real. It is not about the love being wrong. The love was not wrong. It is about understanding that the version of this connection you spent so long hoping for, the one that could have existed if the timing had been different, if they had arrived at themselves sooner, that version is not what arrives now. What arrives now is something different, something that can only exist because both of you changed. Grief about what could have been, held honestly alongside openness to what actually is. That is not confusion. That is maturity. The contract was specific, not forever, not even reunion, but the permanent, irreversible shift in how you understand what love requires of you. What completion looks like from inside the lesson of timing is not a reunion that confirms you were right to wait. It is the experience of being able to hold love without collapsing the space it needs to form correctly, of no longer trying to force arrival before both people are structurally ready, of knowing somewhere below all deliberate thought that what is real does not require urgency to remain real. What ends here is not the love. What ends is the version of the connection that could only exist while the lesson was still unfinished. The love, if it was real, does not require the dynamic to survive. Your body already knew this before your mind found words for it. And the evidence of that knowing has been arriving in ways that are specific and physical and real. The settling has been happening quietly. You may have noticed it without naming it, a quality of stillness in the day that is genuinely new, not numbness. You know the difference between those two now, and the difference is important in a way that matters for everything that follows. Numbness is the body shutting a feeling out. This is the body completing a feeling. They are not similar experiences. One is a closing, one is a finishing. They feel nothing alike. Sleep arrives earlier, not dramatically, but earlier by 20 minutes, then 30. And when waking comes, there is less residue in the first minutes of consciousness, less of that immediate reassembly of weight that used to be waiting at the surface of awareness the moment you return to it. That reassembly is taking less time. Some mornings it doesn't happen at all. A name, one that used to arrive with the body bracing around it, the jaw tightening, the breath shortening before the mind had fully registered what arrived, now passes through awareness more like weather, present, then moving through. Not because the feeling behind it diminished, because the body stopped treating its arrival as a threat. This is not distance. You still feel what you feel, but the feeling no longer commands the entire system the way it once did. Where it once required the whole body to manage, it now passes through the way that true things do when the body has stopped fighting them. There is a quiet in the middle of ordinary afternoons now. Not absence, a different kind of presence than the one you've been living inside. The specific quality of being fully inside a moment rather than running a background monitoring process. Less scanning for information that hasn't arrived. More of simply being in whatever is directly in front of you. The jaw releases in the middle of a sentence, not because you asked it to, but because the system simply relaxed around something it used to hold. This is not the quiet of having given up. This is the quiet of something that is genuinely finished. The body knows the difference, even when the mind is still catching up. And what begins to settle into the space that was previously occupied by that constant low-level tension is something with a different quality than anything that was there before. Decisions feel cleaner, not because life became simpler, but because the internal conflict that used to accompany them, the part of every choice that pulled in multiple directions at once, has resolved at its root. Where it once took significant negotiation to arrive at a position you could stand in, it now requires less. The clarity is not louder, it is quicker. And its quickness is evidence of something resolved at the foundation rather than managed at the surface. The things that used to feel exciting but also quietly draining now register differently in sequence. The pull is still recognizable when it arrives, but the cost lands in awareness before the pull has fully formed, and the combination no longer holds its previous appeal, not because you decided to want something different, because something shifted at the root of the wanting, and what that root will now support has changed. Where it once felt like standing in uncertainty was something to endure, it now feels more like standing in open air. Where it once felt like waiting was the cost of caring, it now reveals itself as something closer to trust that doesn't need to be earned back every hour. Where it once felt like security was something to be found in the external confirmation of the connection, it now feels like security is simply where you stand, something you carry rather than something you locate in another person's choices. The synchronicities are changing character. They used to feel like nudges, pointing toward something not yet arrived, creating movement toward rather than arrival at. Now they feel more like confirmations. The universe is not pointing you toward where you should be. It is beginning to respond to where you already are. That is a different relationship with the world you move through entirely. You are not waiting to become someone. The becoming already happened. In private, without announcement, in the exact window where it had to happen to be real. What is here now is not preparation. It is arrival. After this, certain things become unavailable to you, not as a decision you make, not as a new standard you declare, but as a biological fact about what your nervous system can no longer accommodate without registering the incompatibility immediately and accurately. Being held at emotional arm's length by someone who knows exactly what they feel, who has full access to the awareness of what exists between you and chooses to keep that awareness in a private room rather than bring it into honest contact, your body no longer receives this as the baseline cost of loving someone complex. It used to. You could once identify the signs and still interpret them charitably, still make the distance feel less like a choice and more like a circumstance. That interpretive generosity is gone, not replaced by suspicion, replaced by accuracy. The body now reads emotional arm's length for what it is, a choice made by someone capable of choosing differently, and registers it as incompatible with where you stand, not with anger, with clarity, carrying the full weight of a connection while the other person remains comfortable inside its ambiguity, one person fully present, fully invested, fully in contact with what exists between them, while the other treats the whole thing as optional. This is the dynamic your nervous system used to find ways to make bearable. It developed processes specifically for this: the reframing, the charitable interpretation, the willingness to hold space for someone who had not yet learned to hold space for themselves. Those processes still exist, but they require a resource you no longer have in unlimited supply. The belief, however quiet, that your full presence alone was enough to complete what was fundamentally an incomplete dynamic. That belief ran out, not dramatically, quietly. The way a belief runs out when the evidence against it accumulates past the point where maintaining it costs more than releasing it. Waiting for honesty that the other person has already decided you don't deserve. The pattern of explaining your depth to someone who receives your explanation as proof that you are too much rather than as evidence of what you are. This pattern is now recognizable the moment it begins, not after it has already extracted a cost. On first contact, like a frequency the body identifies before the mind has assembled the evidence. Not something decided, something simply known, the way a trained ear hears a wrong note without deliberating about whether it's wrong. You did not close yourself. You clarified. And clarity does not reduce what is possible. It removes what was never going to be real anyway, and makes the remaining space available for what actually is. Now, if this soul steps back into your field, you will feel the difference immediately. And the difference will be legible in a way it never was before. Whether they return or not is no longer the question that governs your interior. That question lost its governance somewhere in the middle of the private work you did without confirmation. But if they do return, having sat with what Mercury and Lilith and the moon in Libra made impossible to continue suppressing, you will receive them from an orientation that has no precedent in the history of this connection. The first thing you will notice is not excitement. The first thing is clarity. Your body will read the signal before your mind has formed a verdict, and what it reads will be accurate in a way it wasn't before, not distorted by hope, not distorted by fear. The question you will actually be asking beneath whatever words are present is precise. Is what has returned the same version of the dynamic or something genuinely different? Is this the same person in the same internal state with more polished language? Or has something actually changed in them? Not performed, not announced, but present in the way they take up space, the way their attention lands, the way they stay with what is uncomfortable rather than finding a graceful exit. Presence will answer this question. Not words, not gestures, not the acknowledgement of the silence. Sustained, consistent, unperformed presence, the kind that does not require you to make it easy, will answer it definitively. You will know the answer quickly. Not because you are guarded, because you are clear. The skill you developed in the silence, the ability to see what is actually there rather than what you hoped was there, does not switch off when the longing is still present. It becomes more precise, not less, and you will use it. If what returns is genuine, if they arrive having done something real with what this transit asked them to confront, if their presence carries the quality of someone who finally chose honesty over comfort, you receive that from wholeness, from the ground you built in private, not with held breath, with the steadiness of someone who already answered the question of whether they are enough and is now simply present to find out whether the other person caught up. If they do not return, if the recognition activates in them and they still choose the silence, that absence confirms something too. Not that you were wrong about what existed, not that the love was imagined, that they have not yet arrived at the version of themselves capable of meeting what you are now capable of receiving. And that confirmation, while it carries its own grief, does not diminish anything you are. It simply clarifies what was always true. Love requires readiness on both sides to become what it is capable of being. One person's readiness cannot substitute for the other's. You learned that. They are still learning it. Both doors open onto something real now. Not because the outcomes are equal, because you are no longer different people depending on which one walks through. That steadiness is the thing. That is everything. If something in this transmission landed somewhere specific in your body, not just your mind, but somewhere that felt true before you had language for why, do one thing right now. Like this video, not as a gesture, as a signal to yourself that you were present for this. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. These transmissions build on each other. What opens today connects directly to what arrives in the next window. And in the comments, write, "I receive what is mine." Say it out loud as you type it, for your own nervous system. Words spoken with real meaning complete something that silent reading leaves unfinished. And if someone in your life is standing at a threshold they can't quite name, share this with them. Your soul already knows who. The moon is in Libra now. Not metaphorically, as a precise fact about where the sky is and what that does to the emotional field every person moves through. And what it does is this. It brings into the light everything that has been waiting in the balance, every connection that is not resolved, every truth that has been circling the threshold of being said without quite crossing it, everything that was placed on hold, not because it was finished, but because neither person was ready yet for the full weight of what honesty would require. Something arrived today, not the resolution itself, the conditions that make resolution possible for the first time. That is a different thing. That is, actually, the more important thing. Because doors that open because both people have finally become capable of what the opening requires, those don't close again. What is real doesn't need urgency to hold it in place. What is real simply waits for the moment when both people are finally standing at the same door. Today, in this exact cosmic window, that moment arrived, not as a feeling, as a fact about where the planets are, what they are doing to the emotional field, and what that means for the specific thread of unfinished truth that has been running through both your lives. That person is sitting with something they haven't said. The knowing is too heavy to carry quietly now, and you are no longer the person who needs their arrival to feel whole. You are the person who can receive what arrives with clarity, with warmth, and with everything you built in private when no one was watching. That is not a small thing. That is the whole thing.